Now we'll start on maybe it's something slightly more serious, and rather than go through a laundry list, I mean, maybe you guys, since you're so you have such profound experience, maybe is there one big worry, or a couple big worries that that haunt you today about the future of the ocean?
No.
Because it's a laundry list, or
No, obviously there are.
Is this on?
Obviously there are big worries and big problems, and I think we all know what most of them are. The world is being overwhelmed by the force of our numbers. We're changing the chemistry of the ocean. We run our economy with a system that has strong incentives to destroy what supports life. We run civilization with forms of energy that destabilize the things that allow life to exist. Those are terrifying. But I think that we also all know and can easily access all of the much better ways of doing things. And so to me, hope is the ability to see how things can be better. And that's very energizing, and it's what makes all of us keep going.
I've spent a lot of my time looking at fish and the problems of fishing, and that still ranks very high. I think we all know the problems of overfishing. Part of the problem is just the way we look at fish. We look at it as something that's going to end up in on our dinner plate, or as crops that grow in the sea that we simply harvest at something called maximum sustainable yield, which makes sense to people looking at the ocean full of fish as crops, but not as animals that are actually part of the ecosystem that have important jobs to do out there, like keeping coral reefs clean and eating other fish and doing really cool things like these grouper in the Gulf of Mexico that dig enormous holes the size of swimming pools. They're like underwater farmers, and the other fish come and aggregate there and they eat them. They're like little farmers down there, ecosystem engineers that actually are influencing the ecosystem. So we take fish out of that system at our own peril, and I still feel that's really, really important to remember. And what Carl said about changing ocean chemistry, that has definitely gotten my attention. I hope it's gotten yours. The whole notion of ocean acidification, the plight of coral reefs, the work that WRI has done on that has been outstanding at bringing our attention to what is happening to coral reefs, and it's horrifying. But acidification, sometimes called climate change's evil twin, I think threatens things at an even greater pace than we ever imagined. And this could actually affect more than coral reefs, but right down to the base of the food chain as well, because you've got plankton that secrete calcium carbonate for their shells that just won't have a chance in an acid ocean. So those are the two things that keep me up at night.
Well, let's extrapolate a little bit on that one of those thoughts then on overfishing specifically. Recently, within the past couple months, a top scientist at NOAA retired, and he gave a long interview with the Associated Press in which he said that he felt that overfishing in the United States was over. He thought we were on a generation, on a century-long run, that we were doing better now today than we have in the past 100 years, and he was optimistic about the future of fish in the United States, at least. The suggestion was that legislation and regulation was working, and he didn't elaborate region by region, but he talked a lot about the Northeast, where they because of quotas and catch shares, they have slowed in regard to taking some species. But that notion that the problem with that kind of interview is that the headlines end up reading overfishing is over, And any of us who pay attention to the subject know that's not true. When 90% of the fish that are out there are gone, we're fishing the last 10% now, etc. Carl, is overfishing over?
Well, the only place I would talk about this is in Washington, where people are actually really interested in policy. But legally speaking, overfishing is over in the United States because last year the legislation said that fishery management plans had to put an end to overfishing, and overfishing is defined in the law, and conceptually speaking, it's catching fish at a rate that's faster than they are reproducing, and that's driving the population lower. The end of overfishing started with the Sustainable Fisheries Act of 1996 that was phased into effect in 1998. There were some significant loopholes to those mandates. The main thing in that act, well, I should go back a little bit. From 1991 to 1993, I was on the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and I learned a lot about what didn't work under federal law. The law authorized the councils to write fishery management plans, and in the course of those fishery management plans, they could enact quotas that eliminated overfishing, but they didn't have to. So I and a coalition of 4 other environmental groups in the early 90s campaigned for 4 years, and we wrote some model legislation that included some really major things, like defining overfishing, creating a list of overfished species, the mandate to review species status, and once fish were on the list of overfished species, the councils had to have a plan to bring them back to the level that would support maximum sustainable yield within 10 years, with a few exceptions. These were new legal mandates that had never existed in the law before. They made a big difference. There were some loopholes, like the biggest loophole was they had to end overfishing within 10 years, but up to year 9 they could still continue overfishing. Obviously that was ridiculous, and the councils were trying to break the system by doing exactly that and saying, see, it's impossible. So there were lawsuits, there were all these policy things, there were big fights over reauthorization, and what happened at the end was that as of last year, councils cannot have a plan that allows for fishing to be done at a rate that's above the calculated maximum sustainable yield. One little sleight of hand is that what they call recovery is not what I would consider recovery. It's recovering the population to the point where it can support the calculated maximum sustainable yield, which is only about a third of what the populations would be at the unfished level. So they're depleted by 2/3 and they're called fully recovered. Everybody should know that if you're interested in fisheries. But yes, the U.S. is doing the best job in the world, which is not saying much, on fisheries management. There's pretty good fisheries management in Australia, possibly New Zealand. Then you go way down to, you take a huge jump down to like the Falkland Islands, South Georgia Island, and in my opinion, no place else. So the U.S. is doing it better than anybody else in the world. We have outlawed overfishing. Yes, a lot of the free fall is finished, and yes, many of the populations are starting to recover, and a few have recovered very significantly, including, I'm happy to say, striped bass on the East Coast. I love fishing for striped bass. Last year I didn't do much fishing because I was immersed in oil like many of us were, but the year before that, best striped bass fishing of my life. And if you want to watch a 1-minute video of fishing on my boat with Andy Revkin of the New York Times, Google fishing lessons with Carl Safina, and it'll come right up. It's only a minute, and you'll see some very big striped bass being caught off montoys. Fishing has been unbelievable, and now that fishery has some problems on the young end of the age distribution. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot of truth to that claim. The more recent claim that it's not so bad globally, from that op-ed in the New York Times by Ray Hilborn, is simply dumb. They They only looked at the places that had really good data sets, which are places like the United States, and then concluded that based on the best available data sets, fishing is not so bad. But if you look at, I mean, everything we know about salmon and cod and groupers and sharks, tuna, billfish, except Atlantic swordfish, which are more abundant now than before, mainly because we put some areas off limits where the juveniles congregate. The fisheries are a tiny shadow of what they were and are in enormous trouble in most of the world.
And that begs or maybe encourages the notion that legislation can make a difference. Legislation can change things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Marine protected
it
areas.
can make a difference. It can make a very big difference, yes, of course.
I think that it's important. The way I came to understand Magnuson-Stevens, the legislation that Carl was talking about, was that you've got fish populations experiencing overfishing and also fish populations that have been overfished. They're in a state of depletion because they've been overfished. So we've ended overfishing, but we still have populations in a state of being overfished. They're depleted, and some we don't know if they'll ever come back, like cod, fish too, just hammered down to very low populations. In fact, in Canada, they were proposing putting at least a couple of those stocks on the Canadian endangered species list. I can't remember if they actually did that or not. The other thing with regard to fishing that kind of slips through when you just hear this soundbite about ending overfishing is the way we are fishing and what we're doing to the rest of the ecosystem. And look at bottom trawling. Bottom trawling is one of the most destructive fishing practices imaginable, and yet we have very few regulations to limit the extent of bottom trawling. I mentioned the Bering Sea a few minutes ago. We were up there, Greenpeace was, looking at the impacts of bottom trawling on deep sea coral populations. And I landed my little sub unknowingly right in the middle of a huge trawl scar where one of these trawls had gone through and scraped everything clean. I thought I had discovered some sort of geologic formation. I couldn't
Were you
tell.
afraid it was going to turn around and scoop up your
Oh,
submarine?
right. I mean, I didn't know what I was looking at first, and then the scale of it is what threw me. And I knew academically that I would probably see this, but to see it and to see the scale, as wide as the wingspan of a 737 and just miles long in either direction and nothing left. And some of these corals are incredibly old, and they're critically important to all the fish. So the continued act of trawling is not only ripping the ecosystem apart, but it's reducing its capacity to make more fish. So if you're a fisherman, you should realize it's a stupid thing to do. So
Once in Nova Scotia, I went to a fisherman wanted us to look in his barn, and he had this museum that he had created of giant pieces of hard coral that had been trawled up decades earlier, and they were pretty much done finding it.
yeah, it's funny. I was at Dutch Harbor Airport, and anyone who's traveled there knows that more often than not, you do a lot of waiting there because of the fog and the snow and the ice, and just hanging around with a bunch of fishermen and crab fishermen. And unable to resist an opportunity, I started giving a PowerPoint presentation in my waiting area to these fishermen I was talking to. And I was showing some of the video we had taken aboard the Esperanza from the subs. And they were saying, oh yeah, we hauled a whole bunch of that onto the deck last week. I saw that stuff. And I said, yeah, that's the point. That's why we're here. We don't want you to do that. We want you to be able to make a living, but to do it in a way where you're keeping that ecosystem healthy. And it's funny because there was definitely recognition among these fishermen of all of these things from the deep ocean.
I'll play devil's advocate for a second then on fishing. I mean, we all do. We all get out there a lot, you know, and one of
Celine's been fishing on my boat.
Sustainable fishing, striped bass.
But all of us, I know we do the same thing. You meet fishermen and on these the most remote places, and you ask them how's fishing. We all do. That's one of my favorite things when traveling. And empirically, at least, the responses I get more often than not is, it's okay. I was recently on Fakarava in the South Pacific this winter. I was in Eleuthera in the Bahamas, and I would go out with these guys, and they say, within their kind of small circle that things are okay. I mean, in the Polynesia, the big concern is the big fleets from China and Japan coming down and fishing. They can't enforce them, as they have no coast guard really in Polynesia. But the question, I guess, if there is a question, is are we sometimes is it a fair criticism to suggest that sometimes we're like Chicken Little? I mean, do we make a bigger deal out of the demise in the numbers of fish than deserves, or is it, or should we be even more worried?
Well, I've had the opposite experience. When I was several years ago, we were working with a fisherman in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and his doctor told him he's a scuba diver, sets traps and spearfishes. His doctor told him that if he doesn't stop scuba diving, he's going to die because he's been bent so many times, decompression sickness, because he's been forced to go into deeper water and to stay down longer to try to feed his family. And the fish that he's bringing back they look like aquarium fish. They're getting smaller and smaller. And I always think of him, of Nicky, when I think of this issue of, he's a great guy, and he's become an advocate with us, standing with us, promoting marine protected areas, because he knows that his kids aren't going to have any kind of a future if they wanted to fish for a living. So, I mean, I think there's two sides to that issue. I think that you also see some fishermen who are just at the limits of what they can do to make a living, and are waking up to this issue.
Oh, well, I think overall the problems are really serious, but you can look around the world and you can see places that are really quite good and places that are really quite trashed. If you go to Alaska, I would say Alaska has done a better job of fisheries management than any place in the world, and to a large extent they still have some very large and very viable populations of some economically important things that we all love and love to see, and many of us enjoy eating from time to time. And other places are just just nightmarish. So it's really important not to have a one size fits everything idea of what's going on, but to look at what is working, what is failing, and what the driving forces are, and not feel like you're stuck to a script that says either everything is terrible or everything is fine, because none of it is that simple, and that kind of a thing is not helpful. It doesn't point you in any direction anyway. So.
Yeah, and I think in any of these conversations, we always have to be really careful about any kind of generalization.
Generally, that's true.
Yeah. No, I've had a lot of experience in Antarctica, and often you'll hear people say, well, Antarctica, the ice is melting in Antarctica. Well, Antarctica is huge. You fit the United States in it easily. Parts of Antarctica are actually getting colder. But the most at-risk place in the world, perhaps, is the skinny little peninsula that is suffering because of rising temperatures, etc.